Empires rarely collapse in moments of chaos. They weaken during periods that look stable, technical, even responsible. The danger begins when production slows, expansion ends, and leadership turns its focus from making things to managing obligations. At first, it feels like maturity, then it becomes habit. So what actually happens when a dominant power stops producing value and starts sustaining itself through debt management? By the end of this video, you will see the mechanism clearly, step by step, across real historical systems. More importantly, you will understand what changes inside an empire long before decline becomes visible to the public. From Rome in the 2nd century to Britain after 1918, and later the United States in the 20th century, the pattern repeats with different tools and names. Each case has a moment when constraints quietly disappear and choices narrow without announcement. Miss that moment, and reversal becomes politically and structurally intolerable. Now let's walk through the pattern, step by step. The Roman Empire offers one of the earliest clear examples of this shift. By the late 2nd century CE, territorial expansion had slowed, and conquest was no longer delivering fresh inflows of land, slaves, or bullion. The imperial system still looked strong, but its engine had changed. Revenue now depended less on expansion and more on extraction. The Roman imperial treasury began relying heavily on taxation across provinces that were already fully integrated. Tax farming expanded, and administrative oversight grew more complex. Maintaining legions, roads, and urban centers required constant funding, even as new sources of wealth dried up. The state was no longer growing its base, it was squeezing it. Currency policy quietly adjusted to this reality. From the 3rd century onward, records suggest repeated debasement of the denarius under emperors like Septimius Severus and later during the crisis of the 3rd century. Silver content declined while face value remained. This was not fraud in the modern sense, it was emergency management. Debasement bought time but altered incentives. Prices rose, trust in currency weakened, and local economies shifted toward barter and self-provision. The empire did not collapse immediately, it adapted. But each adjustment traded future stability for present solvency, narrowing options with every cycle. By the 4th century, Rome was still administrating a vast territory, collecting taxes and paying armies. What it was no longer doing was generating new productive capacity at scale. The system survived through management, not growth. That distinction mattered more than it appeared at the time. The Spanish Empire reached its peak with unprecedented access to wealth, not productivity. After 1492, silver from the Americas flowed through institutions like the Casa de Contratación in Seville. By the mid-16th century, this inflow replaced the need to develop domestic industry. Spain was rich, but increasingly hollow. By 1557, the Spanish crown defaulted on its debts for the first time. Wars in Europe were financed not by production at home, but by future silver shipments already pledged to creditors. Genoese bankers managed royal finances more closely than Spanish manufacturers shaped the economy. Debt coordination replaced value creation. This pattern repeated. Defaults followed in 1575 and 1596, each time treated as a technical reset rather than a systemic warning. Inflation surged across Europe as silver expanded the money supply. Inside Spain, agriculture and manufacturing weakened under taxation and neglect, while imports filled the gap. The empire still projected power. Fleets sailed, armies marched, and administration continued. But the core mechanism had shifted. Spain was no longer converting labor and skill into wealth. It was converting future claims into present survival, one refinancing at a time. By the early 17th century, the structure could no longer sustain itself. The silver slowed, confidence fractured, and the system that once seemed endlessly solvent revealed its dependence. The collapse was sudden only to those who missed the earlier substitutions. Britain entered the 19th century as the most productive industrial power on Earth. After 1815, the Napoleonic Wars ended, but the financial architecture built to sustain them remained. The Bank of England and the British Treasury had normalized long-term state borrowing as a permanent feature, not a temporary necessity. Debt did not immediately weaken Britain. In fact, it strengthened its global reach. London became the center of international finance, insurance, and trade settlement. Capital moved through British institutions, even as manufacturing leadership began to face competition from Germany and the United States. By the late 19th century, returns on overseas investments often exceeded returns from domestic industry. Financial intermediation became more attractive than factory expansion. The empire increasingly managed flows of capital rather than producing goods at the frontier of technology. The transition was gradual, almost invisible. World War I accelerated the shift. By 1919, Britain exited the war heavily indebted, with industrial capacity strained and global creditors rising. The Treaty of Versailles reshaped Europe, but it also locked Britain into a system where servicing obligations constrained rebuilding. Finance remained dominant because alternatives were politically costly. Britain did not collapse in the interwar period. It adjusted, retrenched, and preserved influence through institutions and currency management. But the empire that once produced at scale now depended on coordination, credit, and confidence. The transformation was complete before it was widely acknowledged. The United States inherited this structure after 1945, but with a crucial difference. At Bretton Woods in 1944, the dollar was anchored to gold, and global reserves were anchored to the dollar. This system worked because the United States combined financial authority with unmatched industrial output. Production and credibility moved together. For roughly 25 years, the balance held. American factories supplied reconstruction in Europe and Japan, trade surpluses accumulated, and debt remained constrained by gold convertibility. The U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve operated within an external limit that forced discipline, even during expansion. By the late 1960s, that constraint became uncomfortable. The Vietnam War, domestic social programs, and overseas military commitments expanded, spending faster than production. Dollars accumulated abroad faster than gold reserves could support. Foreign central banks, especially in Europe, began questioning convertibility. In 1971, the Nixon administration suspended gold convertibility. Officially, it was framed as a temporary adjustment. In practice, it removed the final external check on debt expansion. From that moment on, credibility rested on policy management and global confidence, not on a production-backed promise. The system did not break. It adapted. Debt issuance accelerated, monetary tools expanded, and financial management replaced industrial reform as the primary response to imbalance. This was the quiet crossing. The shift was not debated as a turning point, but its consequences would compound for decades. Once debt management becomes the core stabilizer, internal dynamics begin to change in predictable ways. Capital flows toward financial assets because policy increasingly protects them. Manufacturing returns look slower, riskier, and politically unsupported. The economy still grows on paper, but its center of gravity moves. By the 1980s and 1990s, this was visible across advanced economies. Wages lagged behind asset prices, especially housing and equities. Productivity gains no longer translated evenly into income. Central banks focused on price stability and market confidence, not on rebuilding industrial depth. Debt rollover became routine. Governments refinanced obligations instead of retiring them, and markets treated long-term liabilities as abstract numbers. This reduced urgency. Structural reform could always be delayed another cycle because borrowing remained cheap and external confidence held. The 2008 financial crisis exposed the mechanism without dismantling it. Monetary policy replaced reform once again. Central banks expanded balance sheets, absorbed government debt, and stabilized asset markets. Production did not meaningfully reorient. Management intensified. At this stage, flexibility narrows. Servicing existing obligations dominates policy choices, and any attempt at contraction threatens instability. The system functions, but only within a shrinking corridor of acceptable outcomes. The exit costs grow higher than the risks of continuation. At this point, debt is no longer a tool. It becomes the terrain itself. Policy decisions are evaluated less on long-term productivity and more on their effect on confidence, yields, and asset stability. The system optimizes for continuity, not renewal. Institutions adapt to this reality. Central banks coordinate closely with treasuries, absorbing government debt as routine policy. Laws and agreements like the Maastricht Treaty attempt to impose limits, but enforcement bends under pressure. Stability is maintained by signaling rather than restructuring. Production does not vanish, but it loses priority. Trade deficits persist even during expansions, justified as manageable. Financial employment grows faster than industrial work because it aligns with the system's needs. Managing claims becomes more valuable than creating goods. Public debt reaches a political boundary. Reducing it becomes framed as dangerous or unnecessary, while expansion is normalized as neutral. Voters are insulated from immediate costs, and long-term trade-offs fade from debate. The burden shifts forward quietly. This is the late-stage pattern. The system still functions, often impressively, but it now depends on uninterrupted confidence and constant intervention. When management replaces production completely, resilience gives way to fragility, even if the surface remains calm. History shows that decline rarely announces itself with collapse or panic. It arrives through a series of reasonable adjustments, each one designed to buy time, reduce friction, and preserve stability. Taken alone, none look fatal. The danger is cumulative. When production is slowly replaced by management, future choices narrow without debate. What remains is a system that must keep moving forward, not because it is strong, but because stopping has become unthinkable.